Welcome to the Better Questions podcast. Today, we're really excited because we've got a person who is a good friend of all three of us, Joe Mueller, who all of us have had the opportunity to do ministry with at one point or another. Joe will introduce himself more in the podcast, but he's wrapping up a PhD in Old Testament studies. And so today, we wanted to take some time to address the question with him, do Christians need the Old Testament?
That's right, yeah, and there has been some recent controversy around this question with some of the things Andy Stanley has said recently, and we definitely dive into that, and so if you're interested in that, we definitely do address it.
And you might be looking at that hour and a half or whatever huge number you see at the bottom of your podcast feed. I just want to tell you, just suck it up because it's awesome. Extend your drive a little further or, get comfortable at your house where you're watching it on YouTube, the two of you that watch our YouTube videos, because it's definitely worth it.
Hey, I do want to say two things. One, we have over 100 views on a few of the videos.
Hey, our one with Carolyn is over 160, and our one with Dr. Chris Keith is in the 150s.
Yeah,
that's amazing. But the other thing is, if we decide to break this into two parts, I'm going to leave that in so Andrew still sounds like an idiot.
So what do you mean? It says 25 minutes right here.
So here is our conversation with Joe Mueller. Well, today we're excited to have our good friend Joe Mueller on the podcast with us. Joe, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
Would you mind, before we get started in the conversation, just taking a quick second to let our listeners know a little bit about who you are, your work, and maybe talk a bit about why you got interested in Old Testament studies?
Yeah, thanks. Well, I am a husband of a wonderful wife of a little over 7 years. We celebrated our anniversary just a couple weeks ago, and I'm the father of two boys, hence the dark circles under my eyes. I am a current PhD candidate at Fuller Theological Seminary in the area of Old Testament, and I'm working on a dissertation about the characterization of God in the book of Exodus. And before I began a PhD program, I was a discipleship pastor for about 8 years, which is where I found friendships with some of you guys.
Wait, some? Was that a reference to me?
Which is the one that's not included?
I'll let you decide who belongs to that group.
I feel secure in our friendship, Joe.
That's great. And so I see scholarship as a subset of ministry, at least for me personally. And that kind of works not only into what I'm doing at Fuller, but I'm also doing some adjunct part-time teaching both at Johnson University in Knoxville, Tennessee, and at Duke University's Divinity School in Durham, North Carolina. So I'm glad for those opportunities and the kind of the motivation to get to places where I can teach people about the Old Testament stemmed from all the way back in my childhood when I just loved stories and loved narratives. And the Old Testament has a lot of crazy stories. And so I always found them really intriguing. And that interest just continued to grow as I went to study the Bible in undergrad and had some really great Bible professors who saw that interest and fed into it. And I think that there's a lot to glean from the Old Testament. And as I've learned personally, I love to then turn around and hopefully be able to share what I've found with others and encourage them as well.
So in our podcast, one of the formats that we do when it's a Better Questions podcast is we take a question that we hear a lot of Christians asking, and we want to start to look at it and see how have different people answered that question. Maybe what are some things at stake for people in the way that they've answered it, ways that maybe the question might be misguided, if at all, and work toward better questions. And so the question we really wanted to focus on with you today, Joe, is this question: do Christians need the Old Testament? And I think where that question has really come from us is there's been a lot of controversy and discussion here recently with some things said by Andy Stanley, particularly the phrase that's really gone viral when he said that Christians should unhitch their faith from the Old Testament.
Peter, James, Paul elected to unhitch the Christian faith from their Jewish scriptures. And my friends, we must as well. And I'll tell you why. It's actually the same reason they did. Because we must not make it difficult for those Gentiles who are turning to God.
I'm just curious to start off by asking how you would even respond to a statement like that.
Well, first, I would say, speaking specifically to, in response to the specific Andy Stanley stuff, I am aware of it. I need to be fair to him and say that I haven't watched the sermon or read the entire book to where some of those critiques stem from. But from what my impression is that there is a value and conviction there that I think, in one sense, I recognize as laudable, is recognizing that there are issues that are presenting stumbling blocks between people and a conversation of faith when it comes to the person of Jesus and and what that looks like, what it looks like to be a Christian in today's age. And there's that difficulty of how do we engage with the New Testament and the Old Testament, and some of the things that are said in the New Testament seem to indicate that the Old Testament isn't as valuable anymore. And so I think what Andy Stanley and others throughout church history have tried to attempt at some points is to say that with Jesus, something new happened. And so that's really where we begin and we derive our identity from, and we want to emphasize that and hone in on that, and we don't want to let anything else really detract from that. And so I think, in some senses, okay, I can understand where he's coming from. The problem is that I would, and this is what I would kind of say more generally, is that when you look at how Jesus defines himself in the scriptures and how every New Testament writer defines faith and what relationship with God looks like, they all go back to the Old Testament as part of the authority that they cite as support for their own arguments, as illustrations and images and language for defining what they're talking about. And so if we to use that word, unhitch ourselves from the Old Testament or even the New Testament from the Old Testament, it's kind of like walking in to the Lord of the Rings halfway through the third movie. If you have no idea what's going on, why are these two really short guys climbing a mountain? What's all of these big elephants doing in the middle of this field fighting a bunch of horses? It just doesn't make any sense. And so I think there is a better way to go about it that on the one hand acknowledges the difficulties that sometimes that people in our context face when trying to reconcile everything that they find in the Bible with Christian faith, but without just ripping off 2/3 of the Bible and tossing it in the trash. I think there's a better way to go about that.
Yeah, I think for me, again, I also, like you, have not read the book or heard the sermons that Andy Stanley preached. But when I first heard about this, it was in another sermon that I saw of his where he said something similar. And it seemed to me like more what he's trying to say is if we are going to put our faith in Christ to find salvation through what he did on the cross, then we don't quote unquote need the Old Testament version side of the story to gain salvation or even to, evangelize, though it's still useful and helpful to know that, kind of like filling in the gaps later. And so like for me, I quibble over, I think this is a bad question because of that word need. And so I just wonder, like, if you can expound maybe even further on how do we use the Old Testament now, if you would agree we maybe don't quote unquote need it to become a Christian and find salvation.
Yeah, I think that's good, and that's a good point. It's similar to any of those kinds of like minimalizing, tightening type questions. Can I survive on bread and water? Well, I guess technically you could. I mean, whether that's a really worthwhile, exciting way to live, that's another question. But I guess technically yes, and can I live without any sort of long-term relationship or permanent shelter or support system? Again, I guess technically yes, but again, are we talking about surviving here or thriving? And I think that those sorts of questions set up unnecessary lines in the sand or distinctions that don't need to necessarily be made.
I think where I struggle in trying to respond to this question is one of the words that has gotten used a lot, specifically in the context with Andy Stanley, is the word faith. So like he has said, Christians should unhitch the Old Testament from their faith. Or another quote I wrote down that is, he said that the Old Testament shouldn't be the go-to source regarding our behavior in the church. And so I think where some of this question comes from, do Christians need the Old Testament, it is maybe not even that they would say, well, it has no use whatsoever. I think a lot of them would agree with you in your Lord of the Rings example. It does help us understand how we got to this point, but saying that is way different than saying it is authoritative, it is inspired. When I go to the Old Testament, like, God expects me to do the things that it says. It has things in there that I need to listen to and implement in my life in order to receive salvation. I feel like those are very different types of questions than just, is it helpful when it comes to understanding Jesus? And so how would you respond to that? And also how, kind of understanding that dilemma, what would you say the Old Testament does or doesn't have to offer to the faith and salvation and authoritative conversation?
I think there's a couple different topics or questions that you rolled into there. So make sure that I'm tracking with you and answering everything that you're looking for here.
Well, I'll keep you in check, Joe. Don't you worry.
I appreciate that. Yeah, I've always been able to count on you for that. Let me start off by saying, or asking you kind of a follow-up question. And that is, do you follow every New Testament command or think every New Testament command is literally authoritative in the practice of your contemporary church experience?
Well, I have both of my eyes, Joe, so.
I make every female in my family wear a head covering to church every Sunday.
Exactly, right? Yeah. We have to recognize that even though the Old Testament might seem more so, that both the Old Testament and the New Testament are writings that were written in a context different than our own. And so all of them, and reading and interpreting and living in accordance to, and even seeing them as authoritative in our lives, for all of those texts is going to involve some level of purposeful interpretation using certain presuppositions or methodologies or understandings about what it takes to bridge from that context and that in that arena, whether BC or first century AD to our own 20 centuries later. And so you can't just say, well, because the Old Testament is different and strange, it's not valuable anymore. But the New Testament, that's where we can go, and that's different. Well, it is kind of different, but they're also both different from us. And so at what point is it all of a sudden okay? Is it okay once the Greeks come in and start, turning, adding Hellenistic, philosophy and worldview into the mix, so that all of a sudden things seem a little bit closer to where we are today? So if we acknowledge that both testaments require some sort of interpretive bridge or interpretive journey to appropriate and apply to our lives, I think that opens us up to better, again, some better questions or some better opportunities to interact with the text on the grounds of, okay, what does it look like then simply to engage with a text that I have to work with in order to make it immediately applicable, and I think that helps get you in the right direction, whether you're translating or dealing with something from Paul, or you're dealing from something in Proverbs or Psalms or what have you. If we did just rip out the Old Testament, I guess the question is, well, don't we get a better version of God's teaching in the New Testament, or isn't what we find in the New Testament encapsulate everything, and that we would get a value in the Old Testament, et cetera, et cetera? I could easily flip that question and say that almost everything in the New Testament, teaching-wise, any instruction, any principle that you find in the New Testament, including what's taught by Jesus, is either can be immediately found also in the Old Testament, or at least introduced or anticipated by the Old Testament. And so to say that there's this radical difference in teaching, I think is making a distinction that's not really there. I mean, can you guys name me a instruction in the New Testament that you couldn't find in the Old Testament, or at least something similar?
No, I can't. I mean, in fact, where my head goes is what Jesus often said is, "You've heard it said, but I tell you." And it's like, well, where have they heard it said? I
know later tonight I'm going to be like just about to fall asleep, and then something's going to pop in my head, and I'm going to be like, why didn't I say that?
Dan, you bring up the Sermon on the Mount, and I think that's a place people go to first, or often, in making this distinction. Exactly what you said. You've heard it said, but I say to you, do not murder, but do not be angry, or do not, hate. And
right,
both of those instructions are found in the Old Testament. Do not lust instead of do not commit adultery. Like the 10th commandment is do not covet your neighbor's wife. I mean, that is that instruction,
Not to get too lost in the weeds, but I feel like, because I've had you push back on that very topic, either to me or like someone in a Facebook comment section, and I thought it was interesting. But I think where the confusion happens is why so many people jump to the Sermon on the Mount to be like, see, Jesus is like changing the Old Testament. The more I think about it, I think it's because the Old Testament a lot of the times is in continuity with a lot of those teachings. I think where the confusion happens is sometimes the actions of people in the Old Testament look very, very different from the commands of Jesus. And so people go, well, there's a lot of tribalism and like, I don't know if racism is the right word, but like hostility towards Israel's neighbors and murder and adultery. And so people associate all those actions with the Old Testament and forget that right next to him is the command to be like, no, you're the light to the nations and you are to be this way. So I think that's where a lot of the confusion happens, is there's all these actions in the Old Testament that go against Jesus' teaching, and you think, oh, Jesus was like, well, let me set the record straight here.
Well, another piece of that too is I think now that I'm thinking more about it, like you often hear people talk about how Jesus will at times almost reimagine the Old Testament text. Well, like the time when he takes the scroll and he reads from Isaiah.
Oh, that's
and
a good point.
He's like then saying, well, that's pointing to me, basically. And like some point out then
he
that
cuts
that's him
off the quote early.
He does, and it's almost like he's doing what I've kind of heard is also a practice of how Jewish people interpret Scripture, is that they are more willing to take liberties or to interpret things and say like, oh, this is a new reimagining of our old interpretation of this because this has now been fulfilled among you or among us.
In what way is Hosea 6:1, which says, "Out of Egypt I called my son," pointing to Jesus, right? Like Matthew says that.
I had that question
waiting, Joe.
Yeah, exactly.
I think it's undeniable that there is, in light of Jesus, new ways of interpretation that's happening in the New Testament community. That after his death and resurrection, they are looking back on the Old Testament texts in a way that they had never thought about them before. I think the difference, what I would say, however, is that does not eradicate or wash over or paint over, I guess you could say, the meaning that was there previously.
That's
the kind of the official term is the sensus plenior, like this additional meaning or this fuller meaning, that this even kind of spiritual meaning that doesn't mitigate the literal or original meaning, the intention of the text, but it shows how there was something providentially contained within the kernel of that text that then blossomed once Jesus came on the scene. And so I don't think that, again, and I'll kind of take this back to those specific instances that, that like the one you mentioned in Isaiah, and, I mentioned it in Hosea. I don't think that by using those things in a relationship to Jesus, that any of these authors are saying that this is the only way that you can read these texts, and all of the other ways were bad. And specifically, dealing with what you said, talking about Jewish interpretation, not just previously, not leading up to Jesus, but even in the centuries after Jesus, would continue this way, that where these discussions and kind of debates and wrestling through these texts were held together and kind of and placed in a line with one another, where this rabbi says this, and this rabbi says this, and this rabbi says this, and in many cases there's not a conclusion at the end of this topic that says, well, obviously this one of those is right. It's simply allowing these interpretations to exist on different levels of meaning, because of the different contexts in which those meanings or those interpretations are found. And I think that's an important point for us to kind of consider. There's a good way of thinking about this by Pete Enns in his book, why am I blanking on it? Inspiration, what is it?
Incarnation.
Incarnation, Inspiration, yeah. Where he says it's, he kind of takes a distinction between a Christological interpretation of the Old Testament and a Christotelic interpretation of the Old Testament, where it leads to Christ, but it's not only about Christ.
Yeah, that's good.
Or another way of saying it is that we have to read the Old Testament and the New Testament bi-directionally. We read it forward and backward, and we can't only read it in one of those directions, which I think is a fault of of a lot of just regular Christians is that their understanding of the Old Testament is almost always only through the lens of the New Testament reading backwards.
Right.
And that's, I think, honestly, where a lot of these issues of kind of just unhitching it kind of come from, is that the only experience of interacting with the Old Testament comes through the New Testament anyway. So why do we need the Old Testament if it's always just coming by way of the New Testament?
If I may, before we, maybe continue, because this might be even taking things slightly off topic, but I think it's still related. I just wanted to drill down on that a little more because I'm super interested in your thoughts on this. But do you think that we would, as Christians, gain something that we're missing if we did view even the New Testament scriptures in a similar way that the Jewish people view the Old Testament scriptures then, and how they interpreted and how they discussed and how they even participated in Midrash? And then a secondary follow-up is like, do you think we'd also gain something if we also participated in some of the meals and like rituals that are in the Old Testament? Like if we celebrated Passover or Hanukkah, like is there something that we can gain as Christians by participating even with the New Testament in the same way that the Jewish people used to with the Old Testament?
Yeah. One quick quibble: the Hanukkah is not actually in the Old Testament. It is, I guess.
Oh, that's true. Maccabees, yeah.
Maccabees.
There's a great episode of Rugrats where they go over the story of the Maccabees and Hanukkah. I just wanted to throw that out there for all the '90s kids watching.
That's another episode you guys need to do. Is cultural appropriation of these in cartoons.
Prince of Egypt.
There you go.
I feel like most Christians today are like, there's one right interpretation and we just have to find it. And once we do, we then have to argue and defend it, instead of like, I feel like there's something beautiful about that idea of, holding multiple interpretations simultaneously and just kind of living in the tension.
Oh, yeah. The problem, I think, with trying to find the one meaning of the text is that no one ever has.
Right.
And there's a certain level of hubris in saying that we are going to achieve what no group, community, person so far in the history of encounter with God has been able to do. So I think rather than trying to affirm and find, and that's not to say that we shouldn't hold, truthfully and faithfully and strongly to what we believe about Scripture and faith and all that kind of stuff. But there's a certain level of humility that we all need to possess in our own understanding, knowing that we are limited by space, time, in every way to the form. And all of us are trying to engage with a being who is beyond time, beyond space, beyond gender, beyond ethnicity, beyond socioeconomic status, is beyond all of these things. And so I think it's troubling if a one person in one situation, one set of circumstances can say that they've figured out God and what God is intending in all of his infiniteness for all time. This is it. And so if meaning is continually provided by these texts, I have different questions than what a Jew in first century Palestine had, and I have different questions than what keep moving, on and on and on. And I think you get that even more in the Old Testament.
Right.
Is that you see a plurality of voices coming from a variety of perspectives, and all of them have something to say about God's encounter with them. And if we silence some of those voices, we are silencing voices that could be the very ones that certain people in different contexts than our own need to hear in order to encounter God for themselves. And I think that's a disturbing thought.
Joe, before we transition over into talking about maybe hammering down a little bit more, what do we use the Old Testament for? What role does it play in the church or in our preaching? What are better questions we can ask? I do want to spend a little more time kind of breaking down some of the different reasons why I think Christians are asking this question. Do we need the Old Testament? And we can't address that question without talking about our friend Paul, or maybe more accurately, our friends who preach Paul. And the reason I say that is because I have heard so many sermons out of the letters of Paul specifically that basically say something along these lines. The Jews tried to follow the law to earn their salvation, and they thought that would make them good enough. But now after Jesus, we don't have to do that anymore. We don't follow the law. The law doesn't save us. AKA, the law is bad is kind of the subliminal message there. And so I guess I'm wondering, one, is that even an accurate view of what the New Testament writers are actually saying about the law? And maybe what are better ways to talk about how the New Testament views the law?
For a long time, it was pretty well agreed upon that is what Paul had in mind. And it was thought that the Jews specifically thought that the law was the means by which they could attain salvation. For the last several decades now, but latter half of last century, that view began to be challenged, and understanding that for the Jews, at least of the first century, the law was not something that was a means of attaining salvation, but it was a response to being in a covenant relationship already with God. It was the means by which they demonstrate their identity. I think that is an important distinction to make, because it's not all that different than what we have in the New Covenant arrangement with Christ and the New Testament writers. The difference, I think, is that the New Testament or the New Covenant is that there wasn't Jesus. I mean, that's the big distinction here between the Old Testament and the New Testament. We identify ourselves, and we identify ourselves through Christ. But that doesn't mean that the law was in and of itself horrible. I think what you have is Paul trying to argue against people who are, as people who are supposed to be identifying with Jesus as their new means of identity, still trying to go back and say that the same thing applies. That it's almost like the law still almost trumps Jesus, or the law still has something to add to Jesus. So the preaching that you're seeing isn't altogether wrong to say that the authority that we have to live out the life and faith that we have is not found at Sinai. It's found on Calvary, if we choose to follow God through Christ.
You kind of touched on this earlier in the discussion when you asked us what things in the New Testament do we not obey, and I had you as an Acts professor, in fact, and I wanted to talk about Acts 15 briefly, because I think that's a really interesting passage, and that's actually one of the key passages Andy Stanley cites in his reasoning for unhitching, however he terms it. And I wanted to know today, what sort of liberty do we have as Christians to interpret and interact with the law or commands in the Bible, because Acts 15 seems to set a precedent of the body coming together to dialogue and discern how certain commands or teachings apply today. And in light of like you referencing certain commands in the New Testament that may or may not be obeyed, I just want to know from your perspective, how can Christians go about exercising discernment and deciding how to live out commands that do seem outdated or troublesome, like the situation in Acts 15?
I think what you're seeing in Acts 15 is a recognition by the New Testament church that, again, the stipulations of the Old Testament, Old Covenant, initiated through Sinai, etc., was intended primarily for the nation of Israel. And I think what they recognize is that what Jesus did is not for one specific people or location, but for every people and tribe and tongue and language. And so there is a need to go back and wrestle through exactly the question that you're asking, Andrew, is what of our tradition is constrained to a specific context or time and people, and if a certain law, instruction, teaching was given to a certain group of people, how does that universalize? Does it universalize? And I think what they recognize is that in a lot of the specific cases, it universalizes only very abstractly, and there needs to be that interpretive bridge. Even the quote unquote laws of the Old Testament were, in a lot of ways, I think, more often understood as a ethical symbol than what we understand when we think of legal. And when we open a legal code of a state or the federal for we understand that this has to be broken, and then we have to go to court. We have to do all these things, and for them, I think, for instance, let me use one example. There's a certain number of offenses in Deuteronomy that in Deuteronomy, if you commit one of these offenses, Moses says the penalty is death in some way or form or fashion. Let's say, for instance, committing adultery, right? We have no record in the Bible or otherwise of an adulteress being stoned. So what does that tell us? Well, it might just be an argument from silence, sure. But I think what it also might be insinuating is that maybe the issue wasn't, maybe you weren't, it wasn't supposed to be reading this and say, oh, death penalty. Yeah, let's take it down. Let's do it right away. Maybe it was another genre of crystallizing what type of ethical principles and values were most important to the fabric of being for this community. Family and fidelity are important to God, and critically important, of almost utmost importance by that standard of the judgment given there. And so there's a lot of things that might be at first blush just way off from the way we think about things in the Old Testament. And I think what's important is to maybe try to drill down underneath and try to seek out what is being communicated through those things about what God thinks is important. And see what way that maybe we can identify a contemporary parallel in our own experience.
So I recently read a story about how John Calvin worked with the laws in Deuteronomy about charging interest on loans, because there's a command against that in Deuteronomy, and so like the church was just refusing to participate in that, and John Calvin kind of looked at it and was like, well, but the context we live in now is completely different, to where charging interest on loans can actually be a mutually beneficial relationship. And he said the spirit of this text is really about oppression of the poor. And so it's not so much at all times and all places God condemns charging interest on loans. It's that we shouldn't oppress the poor, and we can still value that in our current context. Is that similar to what you're advocating with what you said?
I think maybe the only caveat that I'll place on myself, and maybe what you've kind of brought out, is that there is a great value, I think, in the fact that the Old Testament a lot of the time is so drastically different in how it thinks about ethical concerns or matters than maybe what we tend to gravitate towards immediately in our own consideration. And the knee jerk, I think, because of that difference, that distance between us and the thinkers of the Old Testament, is to immediately side with our own value systems, and try to think about ways of fitting the Old Testament into our current context. I think that it is equally important and valuable for us to allow the Old Testament to open our eyes to maybe blind spots in our own thinking. And this is, the case of when you encounter any difference in perspective, right? Is that not only, in doing so, if you come into it with an open mind and an open heart, you can see that maybe you've been missing something all along. Now, that being said, I mean, the Jubilee year, you see that in the Old Testament, things like that. That's another thing that we don't have any record of them actually doing. It's like this great ideal that we have recorded in the Old Testament, but they never got around to it. It's like life is life, oh well. Life goes on, and you just kind of forget about some of those things. So do we just forget about it and not worry about it? Or do we say, even though they were in a context where they weren't necessarily able to live this out either, that doesn't mean that they didn't stop thinking about it, and that didn't stop them from writing some form of what they wanted to achieve and a place they wanted to get to in terms of these values, where every 49 or 50 years they just say everything's good, we're just everybody's free, all things canceled, everybody's in the green. And yeah, to try to live that out in our own society might cause a Great Depression, because of the way that we've structured it. And so maybe it wouldn't be beneficial to just try to institute it legalistically. But I think that certainly is something, a value that we need to look at. And that's not just because I'm talking from the perspective of somebody who has some student debt, right? But it would be great if every 7 years it was just like, debt's canceled, right? Don't have to worry about them anymore. No.
Heck yeah.
Well, I just want to point it out that Chris wrote in our Google Doc, Andrew, you get the next couple questions. I asked one, and then Chris was like, "Hold on,
well, I wanted to follow up. I wanted to follow up on Joe's answer before we moved on to the next thing.
I also had a follow up to that. Anyway,
go ahead, Andrew. Ask it.
You asked my follow up for me.
Oh, sorry.
But I guess to maybe organize this a bit, I know this could be its own podcast episode, but I think for a lot of people today, the reason they feel distant from the Old Testament and are uncomfortable with it is the more morally reprehensible parts of it. And I know we've talked to you about this before, but I would just love to know how you yourself or how you would recommend reconciling maybe parts of the Old Testament that, from our perspective in our culture today, come across as very, try not to think of pejorative terms, but come across as like antiquated and outdated and backwards. And so whether that be violence or just maybe some of the ways they thought about other people in society, like women or foreigners, how can we as Christians have a healthier understanding of those passages and not end up throwing all of the Old Testament out because of it?
And before you answer that, if I could add, because I know Andrew means this as well, so much of that also, I think, distances from the Old Testament because a lot of it gets associated with God. Like God commands for those things to happen in a lot of the Old
which
Testament.
Is where you get all the Marcion stuff and is it a different God or whatnot.
The first couple things that come to mind don't really redeem the Old Testament as much as put the New Testament in equally hot water, I guess you could say. If you're operating with these kinds of terms or approaches, there are equally troublesome, quote unquote, aspects of God in the New Testament. The God in the Old Testament never sends anybody to hell. It doesn't happen. And yet in Matthew, you have Jesus saying, do not be afraid of the person who can kill the body, but be afraid of the one who can destroy the body and the soul forever, right? You have the God of Revelation, Jesus, coming to earth with swords shooting out of his mouth like laser beams, going off on entire groups of people who are standing against him. And so there isn't that sharp of a distinction between, quote unquote, the wrathful, vengeful God of the Old Testament and, quote unquote, the loving, peaceful Jesus is a friend of mine of the New Testament. I'm not saying that I'm okay with a God that just likes to blow up cities and stuff like that. Like, I think it troubles me to read these passages too. Let me put that out there before I say what I'm about to say and get fired from things. But again, on the other hand, we are approaching the scriptural texts, which have been written over a long gamut of contexts and circumstances, with our own moral value system in place. And we need to understand that moral system did not rise up in a vacuum. We also are creatures of our own context and our own circumstances. And so the reason that we find certain things troubling and other things that we are okay with is partly because of, I think, God's image in us and that sense of conscience and morality, but it's also because of the ocean in which we swim. And so I think it's important for us when we come across texts that we find morally challenging or going against what we think is morally right. We need to at least be willing to pose the question, is the text wrong here, or the text's depiction or understanding of God or humanity, or is there even this remotest possibility that I might be out of alignment? And again, I'm not trying to just like say that carte blanche, we should just accept everything because the writers of the Old and New Testament were also human beings who lived in context with their own value systems, and that applies to them as well. I'm just saying that we're all in this together, and we need to be willing to engage in this mess without affording either place an automatic position of authority and rightness. Neither one of our cultural contexts is normative, and I think that's important to remember.
And I think what I would add is I agree with a lot of you had to say, is I think the reason this question always keeps popping up and won't go away is because I think sometimes how we answer the question, or how a lot of church leaders unfortunately answer the question, is to almost be like, whoa, like you can't like raise those concerns, because like you can't question God like that. But most of the Old Testament is just people like questioning God. And I find that very necessary and very healthy, and yet we're not even allowed to question the book that primarily questions God, which is a bit weird. And so I think for me, we need to be able to express like this, like you said, like it does bother me, and we should be able to do that. And I think if we allow people to express that, will lead them to a more healthy way of processing the stuff that we in our culture find morally reprehensible, instead of just being like, well, like just don't question God, like, whoa, like don't go there.
Yeah. There's a certain providence perhaps to this, that the first example of expressed theodicy in the Old Testament, in the Bible, that we come across, and what I mean by that is a wrestling over, is this right for God to act this way, essentially, is invited by God to take place. And that is in Genesis 18, God comes to Abraham and says, "Shall I reveal to Abraham what I am about to do?" "Sure. This is what I'm going to do. What do you think?" And the response is, "Shall not the judge of the earth do right?" And then you see this bartering, of well, what about this? Can you spare it if this is if there's this many righteous people? If there's this many righteous, please don't be angry, but can we work that number down further? But I think that's interesting to me, that the first time that kind of interaction occurs, it's promoted and initiated by God. It almost it almost reads to me like this is something that God wants to take place, and encourages to take place for us to be in this kind of dialogue with him. And I think you're absolutely right that you find way more of this kind of back and forth in the Old Testament than you do in the New Testament. I think it's really unfortunate that because Christians don't have maybe as much interaction with, or at least willingness to see the Old Testament as providing something of worth or of equal worth as what they find in the New Testament. Anytime a lot of Christians face some sort of suffering, they think their only valid, acceptable course of action is to say, "Not my will, but yours be done." And I'm not saying that that's bad. I mean, Jesus prayed that after all, right? But the Psalms, for instance, provide us in a number of cases of people saying, "Not thy will be done, but God, thy will is not being done," because they know God's will. They understand what God wants to take place, and they don't see it happening. And so that is cause for them to speak out and say, "God, thy will is not being done, so please do it. Do thy will in this situation."
Parentheses, what the heck, man?
Right. Exactly. And it's a shame that people don't feel the liberty to be able to continue in that mode of expression with God. But that is a canonized, sacred, valid form of expression. I think it's very, very sad.
been talking for quite a while, and it's been awesome. But maybe just to help put our pieces of brain matter back into our skulls after all of the mind explosiveness that's just gone on, maybe a good way to wrap up is to just ask you, what is a better way to either ask this question or a better framework in which to talk about the connection between the Old Testament and the New Testament? For you, like, what are better ways to approach this question?
One of the ways that I've been maybe thinking about this is, instead of trying to pose whether a certain part of the Bible is necessary or problematic or distinct, or how it's different from other parts, I think what might be helpful, at least is helpful for me, is whenever I'm approaching any text, whether that's a specific passage or a book or the Old Testament or whatever, is to try to ask, what does this text show me about God? Or what is it, what could it teach me about God? I don't know, what do you guys think?
I mean, another thing I've gleaned just from our conversation is you keep kind of coming back to this idea of, instead of focusing on, do we need the Old Testament or how are they different, but like kind of asking, how are they the same? Or in what ways do they overlap? In what ways are they working in tandem?
And though you were quoting, I think, Pete Enns, I liked the difference between saying, hey, instead of how does this Old Testament passage like actually all along talk about Jesus, but instead like, how does this lead to Jesus, I think is really helpful.
Yeah, and for me, I know whenever we're addressing better questions, we're always looking for the questions too that lead us to action, which is part of what I think is so bad about this question in general, or any yes or no question, is that no matter what your answer is, it doesn't mean anything. It always requires a so then what question. And you mentioned some of this already with your answer, which I really wanted to ask you how much of that answer was influenced by William Webb's work, but we didn't have time to get into that. But you did talk a little bit about considering, when we're reading a text in the Old Testament, like understanding the culture in which that was written, and how much maybe what is being said goes against the normalized culture at that time. And I think asking questions along that vein as well really push us toward action when we recognize maybe how countercultural of an aspect is this in the Old Testament, and what would it mean for us to carry the spirit of that text in an equally as countercultural way today. Yeah. And to recognize that is not always trending in the right direction. Sometimes neither text obviously reaches the ideal of abolishing slavery that we would hope for. But the Old Testament is actually, I think, more progressive in its treatment of slavery, especially in relationship to its context, than the New Testament is, where the Old Testament is dealing with, indefinite or definite periods of debt slavery predominantly, whereas the New Testament is kind of allowing for shadow slavery, like indefinite, just saying kind of live within those means. And Paul, I think, has some room to grow in that regard. That maybe if he hadn't have thrown out the Old Testament, he could have learned from it.
Joe flexing on Paul. What? Paul murdered people, right? This isn't the guy you mess with.
He's in heaven now. He's fine. He can't reach me. But anyway, Chris, to go back to your point, I think maybe something to kind of keep in mind is how does the direction of the text inspire our direction, our current context. I think.
I like that wording. That's good.
How does the direction of the text shape our direction in living it out? Yeah, I think that's some good stuff right there. I think that's the better question right there.
You nailed it.
I think all the better questions you guys presented were great. So, do we need the Old Testament?
I would say categorically, without question and hesitation, no. No, I'm just kidding. Yes.
It took us an hour and a half to get to no.
Clickbaiting. No, yes. The real question is, do we need the New Testament?
Join us next week.
So we usually end our episodes asking our guests to plug some of their work. I don't know how much...
Joe, where can they read your dissertation?
That does or doesn't apply to you in this season of your life. But if nothing else, maybe you could at least plug a few resources you think would be really helpful to people that want to start digging into more of what we can glean from the Old Testament.
I think, like you said, I don't have a ton in print that's easily accessible right now, but hopefully that will be changing in the near future. I'll keep you all posted. But other than that, I would say my dissertation mentor is John Goldingay, and he's written a ton on the Old Testament in general, but he's also written several, I think, accessible volumes that can help people engage with the Old Testament, especially if they're unfamiliar with it. I just held this up a second ago. It's provocative, but I think that, do we need the New Testament, letting the Old Testament speak for itself? The first line of the book is yes, we need the New Testament, but in asking that question, he's trying to, I think, help people see that the Old Testament has its own value, that it's not just a one-way street. He's also written a series called The Old Testament for Everyone, which is a very accessible commentary series in which he has written a volume for every book of the Old Testament. And that would be a great resource if there is a specific book in particular that somebody is reading through that they're maybe having trouble with. That would be a very accessible volume to maybe help kind of read alongside that to provide some additional insight and also some illustration for how that can be then applied to today. I could go on and on, but yeah, I think let me start with that.
Well, this was a great conversation. It was very much reminded me of the times that I would come into your office back in the day and not do any work for Chris.
It has been a pleasure and an honor for you all to invite me onto this program, and I hope that it's been helpful not only for you, but for your listeners, and I'll be happy to come on anytime.
Thank you.
Yeah, this has been awesome. Thank you so much, Joe.
All right, see you guys.
See ya.
Well, the sound of that music is just telling you that you've listened to another episode of the Better Questions podcast. I just want to thank once again our friend Joe Mueller for sitting down and talking with us, though apparently some of us aren't friends with him, so we're going to have to hash that out here soon. But still, it was a great conversation, and we hope you enjoyed it. So if you like this conversation, find us on Facebook, find us on YouTube, subscribe, like, share the videos if you're enjoying the conversation, and as always, we'll see you next week.